Hi everyone. I'll do a little introduction to myself and Matt, and then I'll do a bit of an intro into this session. But yeah, I'm Alistair Gordon. I'm a director at Arup. I am also the Arup's transport planning skills leader, and for the Delivery Associates Network, I'm the transport SME, and have been working with a number of authorities supporting them on their schemes. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself? You're on mute, Matt.
There you go. It's not like we haven't had a few years since the pandemic to get used to this. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Higgins. I'm a senior transport planner and active travel lead for the Northwestern Yorkshire at Arup.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. And I was also going to say we are also joined by a colleague, Greg Courtney. Greg's hopefully going to get a little bit more involved in the Q&A, but Greg's been involved in designing a number of active travel schemes. I don't know if you want to say hi, Greg.
Yeah, hi, Greg Courtney. So I'm a senior engineer within the sort of civil infrastructure team in the Leeds office at Arup, and yeah, I've had involvement in a number of active travel schemes across Yorkshire in the last maybe 5 years.
Brilliant. Yeah. So just a little bit about the session, and great that we've got so many of you coming. Thanks so much for giving up your time, and we hope you find this useful. Yeah, but just in terms of how we're going to run the session, Matt's going to give the bulk of the presentation. I'll keep an eye on the questions if you put any questions you've got in the chat. What I was going to say is I don't think we will have all the answers, and hopefully we can get into this in the Q&A, but our hope is that in that discussion, as well as us maybe sharing some of our experience and what's worked well and what maybe where the challenges are, it would be really, really great to hear from all of you in terms of how you've addressed some of the challenges that we're facing, share your respective experience. It still does feel quite new. I remember a number of years ago, somebody saying we've not considered cyclists and them saying, oh, just put an advanced stop line in for cyclists, that'll do. And we've certainly changed for the better in terms of really, really looking from the outset at a real mode shift in terms of active travel. But with anything that's relatively new, we do face challenges, and I think that's what today, will be about. As we've said in the presentation, we probably won't go into too much specifics. We'll keep it quite general, but hopefully when we get in the Q&A, we can go into a bit more detail in terms of those specific experience. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, so hi everyone. Good morning. Yeah, as Ali said, thanks for your time. Hopefully, we'll cover a lot of ground that's of interest. I think it's fair to say we're assuming there's a fairly mixed level of experience amongst attendees today. So yeah, we'll cover all the kind of important ground, and then yeah, really hoping to open it up for a good discussion at the end, both between us and amongst yourselves. That'll be really good and valuable, I think. So just a bit about my experience. I've spent the last 4 years at Arup working on lots of different active travel projects, mostly across the Northwestern Yorkshire. But I actually started my career at Transport for London. I spent about 5 years there working in the cycling strategy team, as it was then. So assessing hundreds of routes across London and helping to kind of develop the London-wide cycle network. So many of those routes are now kind of cycle superhighways and cycleways. I spent some time at the DFT on secondment, helping them to develop the kind of LCWIT, the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan tools and guidance for the national audience. I spent some time at Steer, another consultancy, working on active travel schemes as well. So very much kind of my experience is mostly at the kind of front end of projects. So policy, strategy, but then working, looking at optioneering, different route options, and then moving into design. I'm not an engineer. That's why we've got kind of Greg on the call to support if anyone's got any very kind of specific engineering type questions, but we'll cover, a lot of ground. So I'm just going to move the slides on. So yeah, when thinking about what people might be interested in today, I mean, a lot of the questions that we get and I get are kind of when people come up against challenges for delivering LTN 120 standard schemes. People often come in saying there's not enough space for it. What can we do? So I mean, that's probably the question I get asked most from colleagues. I thought maybe that might be something that is of interest to others, and something that we've also come up against when supporting the kind of DAN network and local authorities across the country. So what the slides I'll go through today very much kind of covers, why is there this kind of competition for space? Why is it important that space is provided for active travel? And I guess LTN120 is mostly focused on cycling. Why does it matter? And what are some of the common challenges that we've been coming up against in our experience, and some of the things you might want to consider and potential solutions for that? And then, as Ali says, we'll then kind of stop the recording and then have a good Q&A session on that. I think Ali's going to continue to monitor the chat and interject if there's anything in particular. But other than that, I'll just keep going until anyone stops me or until I get to the end. So there is a battle for street space. We've got finite street space in our towns and cities and villages across the country, but it is kind of 80% of our public space. So a really key part of our lives where things are located. You might be familiar with the kind of street types approach, looking at movement and place functions. So streets, we've got this real balance of uses and users that want to be in our streets. And especially where there's lots of services or key destinations, that's where everyone wants to go and be and have a purpose for being. And given that we've often got kind of medieval or very historic street layouts, without big boulevards or highways you might see in other countries, especially in this country, that's where we get a lot of competition for that space, and that's where everyone wants to be. We've got other constraints like land ownership, geographical features, or other major infrastructure in our towns and cities, which can heighten this competition further. And of course, of the previous decades, we've been designing our urban places for the ease of use for people driving cars. So when we come to it now, we're often looking at kind of retrofitting and reallocating road space and taking space away from established uses of street space, which can be very challenging. So, quite often in these spaces where everyone wants to be, there's things to do, there's transport nodes, there's all different people wanting to move by different transport modes. You get these highly contested, highly constrained locations. This is Holborn in central London. And this is often the type of environment we're dealing with. So when people say, okay, we want to deliver a cycle route through a location like this, we go, well, it's already very congested. Where do we fit it? And who are going to upset by doing so? So, I mean, it's just a case of kind of the busy places. It's where everything is, where people want to be. And it's often very difficult to deliver in these locations, which is why, often you get people making suggestions of, well, why don't you put cycling somewhere else? Whether that's kind of a back street route away from the high street, or if it's kind of more of a leisure route, or, in a location like this where, it might be good for a bit of a leisure trip, but it's no good if you want to get to the bank or the shops. God, bank's quite an old reference now, isn't it? If you want to get to the shops, or if you want to, go somewhere after dark that isn't isolated. So you tend to, especially when I was doing the work in London, you kind of end up with cycle routes that end up diverting away from high street. So it's well, actually the high street, that's where people want to be. So if you're diverting cyclists away from that, then you're taking them away from desire lines. Then when people do actually try and do anything meaningful and reallocate road space from other users, it can be highly contentious, as I'm sure many of us are familiar with, especially kind of these neighbourhood schemes like Mini Hollands, LTNs, which have seen some ferocious kind of backlash. So making meaningful change, is going to upset some people, and that's something that you're gonna have to navigate. But actually, there are plenty of examples where by reallocating road space, there's some really high quality, really great kind of public spaces that have been created and that show it is possible. and you can find a good balance for all road users. There's a couple at the top from Leeds City Centre. We're based in Leeds, hence that bias. But on both those examples at the top, kind of road space has been reallocated from cars and given over to public space and active travel. You've got the Mini Holland there on Orford Road in the bottom left, where kind of road space has been reallocated, and we've got the Greater Green in Sheffield in the middle at the bottom, and then parklets on the bottom right. So you can create some really high quality public spaces, but often you're going to have to make those choices to reallocate that space. It's not going to offer itself up to you. So in terms of what does LTN 120 guidance say? Hopefully you've read the guidance. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll give a bit of an overview and why it's important within this context for kind of creating compliant schemes or good schemes in constrained locations. But first of all, what is LTN 120? So it is kind of a guidance paper. It's cycle infrastructure design guidance, and it's really been brought forward to support the delivery of the cycling and walking investment strategy and gear change ambitions of the government. So you've got on the right there, you can see you've got the policy papers, and they're supported by guidance. And then you've got Active Travel England, who are very much the kind of delivery arm of the government now for active travel. So they kind of hold the budget, approve schemes, inspect schemes, provide training and knowledge sharing. And hopefully some of you have benefited from that to date. So really kind of focused on quality. In recent interviews with members of Active Travel England, they say they're not necessarily focused on compliance, but trying to get the best outcomes. And there's a lot of experience between probably people on this call and people at Active Travel England and others, where we know that certain street layouts are likely to lead to collisions, and a lot of it is really trying to avoid repeating those mistakes and learning from those mistakes and providing schemes that avoid people being the safety being compromised. So just moving on. So LTN 120 is very much founded on some key principles. These are common across many design guidance documents across Europe, most famously the CRO in Netherlands. So to provide good infrastructure, you'd want it to be coherent, direct, safe, comfortable, and attractive. And there's lots of metrics and measures of how to kind of judge whether the schemes that you're developing are how they perform against those principles. And then there's 22 summary principles. But overall, I think a key thing is that it's trying to provide infrastructure that's accessible to all, and it's inclusive for kind of all ages and all different types of users, which I think is really key to remember. So, if you're coming up in a constrained location saying, well, I can't meet those standards, what you're actually compromising on is the ability for people of all ages and all kind of mobility levels to actually use that infrastructure. So something to kind of bear in mind. And I guess there's some examples in the guidance of what that might look like. But essentially, it's creating high quality kind of infrastructure that doesn't give way to all modes. It's legible, you can use it, it's safe. But of course, there is, in these locations, it is really hard to balance different users and different uses of the street. So in no way is anyone saying that this is easy, I don't think. So in terms of, I've pulled out from the document some of the kind of key of those 22 principles, the key ones which I think are relevant to this discussion today. So, the fact that infrastructure should be accessible to all ages, that cycles should be treated as vehicles and not pedestrians, that there should be physical separation from high volume motor traffic, that we need to treat side streets and side junctions to avoid those collision hotspots, that we should be designing for significant numbers of cyclists. So while in many places there might be quite low numbers at the moment, if we're going to provide and spend a lot of money designing infrastructure, then we'd like to think that a lot of people will be using it in the future. Cosmetic interventions are not really that effective. We should be providing kind of coherent networks and infrastructure, not just kind of piecemeal ones. So taking a holistic approach, want to be legible and understandable, it should ensure they flow. But I think one of the key things is this principle 22, when to break these principles, because this is often the question, that people are interested in because they're finding it difficult to kind of meet the standards. It does say that, if there's a bit of a route that, is unavoidable to kind of meet these requirements, then rather than jettison the whole route, then, some breaking of the principles can be acceptable. But in most instances, hopefully, we don't need to kind of get to that point, and there are ways around it and different options. I can see Ali typing. I can't see the chat, but maybe there's something in the chat.
There isn't any questions yet. I've offered them up. I was then going to just message Greg separately to say if there isn't any questions, maybe at the end he can prompt by a discussion by flagging one or two things he's addressing. But that's all I was typing. But cheers, Matt. Gives you a break anyway.
Yeah, and you might be able to hear I'm kind of got a bit of a hoarse voice, so I'm struggling a bit today. But yeah, so this figure 4.1 in LTN 120 is a key one, and it's basically saying that the separation from traffic is very much dependent on the speed and volumes of traffic. So if you've got a 20 mile an hour street with low volumes of traffic, you don't need physical separation for cycling for most users. But then obviously as speeds and volumes increases, you do need that separation to make it safe. Safety is the key barrier for cycling. It's the number one barrier to overcome, and this is just basically saying what levels of separation do you need at different speeds and volumes. There's lots of evidence to show that where you provide this level of protection, that's when you can get huge increases in cycling. So there's lots of evidence to back all of this up as to why that space is needed. And a lot of the kind of historic infrastructure is relying on kind of painted lanes or painted lines, and you can see from the image, you're just not providing the safety needed if you've got like large vehicles or high volumes of vehicles. If you want to provide that accessible infrastructure, which is what we're all aiming for, then obviously painted lines are not going to cut it in many instances. And I don't know if any of you watch or listen to the Active Travel Cafe, but Chris Boardman, our kind of National Active Travel Commissioner at ATE, was on there recently saying that there's data that's due to be published shortly that says that actually if you just have painted white lines, you end up killing 10% more people than doing nothing, and you don't get people cycling. But saying the data is showing that if you build to LTN 120 properly and continuously, you get at least between 20 and 60% increase in uptake, and you halve the number of deaths. So I think it's just really key to remember there's a reason for all of this and providing that protected space. And that, essentially, if you can't do the job properly, then it might be better not to do it at all and encourage people into unsafe situations. So yeah, I'm not going to go through the dimensions of each specific type of cycle that you might be glad to hear. But just to say, a lot of the kind of guidance in LTN 120 is based on lots of metrics and measurements. So one of them being typical dimensions of cycles and minimum turning circles. So that then informs, the width requirements for cycle tracks. You've probably hopefully seen this table 5.2 about kind of minimum widths for cycle tracks in different, whether it's one-way or two-way tracks, and depending on different kind of volumes of cyclists. So, and it considers comfort and the ability to overtake with higher flows. I guess how the way that you kind of know the minimum widths required is based on kind of peak flows, and how do you measure peak hour cycle flows? That's one of the kind of challenges I've put in the slides at the end, because there's a lack of data around a lot of this. And then, as well as the width of the cycle track, you've also got kind of space between the track and other users, which again is there's recommendations based on traffic speeds, which you can see. So that's another factor. So again, it's always providing this kind of protected space to make sure that the space that you want people to cycle in is safe and is going to be attractive enough for people to use it. There's also guidance on junctions. So there's different types of junctions that are set out in the guidance, and the suitable type of junction to use is based on traffic speeds and volumes again. So it's all about providing this protected space that's required. And again, with low traffic speeds and volumes, you might not need a controlled crossing or space. So LTN120 doesn't mean automatically segregated provision. But again, with this, you're looking at traffic speeds, traffic flows, and 85th percentile speeds. How do you get those? Often there's not that data. So again, that's something we can touch on later. And if you're not familiar, the guidance does talk about different street environments. So there might be people on the call from more rural environments as well. But it talks about kind of different spaces within highways, kind of quieter, more residential streets, kind of off-highway links, and lots and lots of different transitions, junctions, and crossings to pick from. I'm not sure I've digested all of them yet, but there's lots to go at depending on the different street context that you're looking at. So, I mean, one of the most common things that I see in designs and I get asked about is kind of shared use, because often, where space is really constrained, there might just be enough space to squeeze in shared use. And by that, I mean kind of space that you're accepting that people are walking, wheeling and cycling all mixed together. Because, to provide a segregated cycle lane and footway, there might just not be enough space for that. And that seems to be really common. But the guidance is really clear on the fact that, that type of environment generally is not good for anyone. People walking and wheeling don't like it. People cycling don't like it. It causes conflict, and it should really be used as a last resort. It's especially bad for visually impaired people. So yeah, it should really just be considered as trying not to end up in that situation. There are recommended minimum widths based on low pedestrian volume routes up to 300 pedestrians an hour. I'm sure lots of people have looked at this table 6.3. It seems to be a common one, again, because this is a situation people end up in. Looking at can I provide a 3 meter shared use path? Can I get away with that? Again, you come up against well, how do you know how many cyclists per hour? So again, we can discuss kind of data sources later. The guidance does set out where shared use might be appropriate. So, where there's few pedestrians, where cyclists might be moving at a slow speed, for example, getting on and off Toucan crossings, where shared length of shared use might be acceptable to achieve continuity. So again, rather than putting the whole route in the bin, if there's a bit of shared use, then, to save the route, then that might be acceptable. And some situations where you get different peak hour flows of people cycling and walking. I think the guidance gives an example of Hyde Park in London, which is quite an interesting one. So there are some instances where, Active Travel England and if people providing funding for active travel are going to accept that. And I'm sure there's people on the call thinking, what about walking and wheeling? Well, of course, LTN120 is cycle infrastructure design guidance, but it does make the point that many of the core destinations are in common, and that when we're redesigning street environments, we should be thinking about all users and making improvements to the pedestrian environment as well as top of the street hierarchy. There is guidance out there. Manual for Streets 2 is the most recent kind of design guidance for walking, and I think the Manual for Streets 3 is due to be released. I think it's been due to be released soon for a long time now. So I think we're waiting for news on that. If anyone's got any news on that on the call, please let us know. And I think it's due to have more kind of detail on integration with cycling in that, from what I hear. There's other design guidance, a bit of a plug for Walking for Everyone, which was developed by Living Street, Sustrans and Arup, which has got some great kind of principles and measures in there. But also kind of the government's LC WIP process, it does include walking, so network planning for walking and wheeling as well. So that's enough on the guidance. I'm sure everyone thinks that's enough on that. Why does this matter? Just one slide to say, just to re-emphasize, it's about road safety, which we've covered. If we don't deliver high quality infrastructure, people aren't going to use it. You need to overcome that barrier of safety. So it's really to enable behaviour change. And why do we want people to walk, wheel and cycle anyway? Well, we've got some key challenges, policy objectives, and we've got climate change, we've got the public health crisis, lots of other, air quality, lots of other policy objectives. And I don't think people necessarily just love walking, wheeling and cycling. I certainly got into this profession because of the benefits that it can have to society, not because I love cycling or walking or wheeling, but actually getting people a bit more active can have massive benefits, both personally and wider to society. And providing value for money, if you're providing good quality infrastructure, hopefully people are going to use it, and you're not just going to be funding routes that don't go anywhere. It was an easy place to deliver a scheme, but actually you've wasted money because no one's using it because it's not where the demand is. To secure future funding, you need to be delivering against LTN 120, well, especially from if ATE are looking at the scheme. You need to achieve that minimum 70% score in the route check tool. Make sure there's no critical fails, which are the ones that we know cause collisions and fatalities, or have any red junction movements in the junction assessment part of that tool, which again, there's evidence to show that those just lead to collisions. And ultimately, we want to all create a better world, don't we? Healthier, happier lives and reduce inequalities. That's enough of the preachy slide. But hopefully we're all on message with kind of so far with why protected space is needed and why we're interested in to start with. So in terms of the common challenges, what I've done is I've listed off the top of my head kind of the top 10 that I come up against in my line of work. There might be others that are on your mind. I've then kind of gone into a bit more detail on the top 5 and grouped some of these together and provided, just explain some of the challenges and some of the potential solutions or things to consider. So rather than reading all of those, I'll just go to the top 5. So probably the number one thing that people come to me about is, there's not enough space to fit segregated cycling infrastructure. There's obviously, in a street environment, there's lots of different uses and users, and there's not much space in many places. So you can end up with some quite wacky designs with big trees. I'm not suggesting you cut a tree down for a cycle lane, but the one on the right is obviously doing the rounds on the internet. So yeah, what do you do about it? As I say, quite often people are saying there's often only enough space for shared space, and what about pinch points and finding a good balance for all users? So there's a few options that we would look at when we're looking at schemes, and we've got this kind of challenge. Is there a way to reduce traffic lane widths? I'm not sure people always think about this, but quite often you kind of get 7.5 meter carriageway that you might be able to reduce down to maybe even kind of more towards 6.5 and nick a meter from the carriageway. Can you reduce, can you reduce traffic speeds and volumes? Do you actually need physical separation and segregation, or do you need that kind of 0.5 meter buffer or so between cyclists and the road users? If you reduce speeds and volumes, does that free up a bit more space? Could you make the street one way for traffic and provide contraflow for cycling? Can you, is there an alternative route for cycling? That's often the first thing that people go to. Is there an alternative route for other modes do all modes need to be there? I think there's some kind of informal absolute minimum widths, which I'm not going to say on record, but I think there are, especially on those kind of pinch points. Can you go even lower than the absolute minimum width, just in a very, very constrained location? Potentially, that's probably something to discuss with whoever's funding or giving, who's on the design review panel for your scheme. I think Greg, our colleague, mentioned this one. Can you acquire land, or is the land to be acquired to fit everything into the environment? And having those early discussions around that can help help you deliver the scheme and reduce costs, not leaving that conversation too late in the process. I found that using the, hopefully some of you seen Active Travel England's route cross section tool, which I've put a screenshot of there on the slide, and it's a spreadsheet tool, and you can build a cross section of the place that you're looking to deliver cycling, and it will quite helpfully. I mean, you should be going to aiming for the desirable minimum widths, but this is showing that there's then an absolute minimum cross section widths. And if you put in the kind of the type of use building up from kind of footway, different cycle tracks, traffic lanes, it'll actually give you the absolute minimum width requirements, and it'll point you to kind of key points in Manual for Streets or DMRB or LTN120 and set out what it says in the guidance. So if you haven't seen this tool, I recommend having a look and having a bit of a play with it. It's really useful if you're helping to develop schemes and trying to work out what you can fit. And you need to put in the available width of the carriageway that you're looking at. Google Street View, Google Maps does a fairly good job at this, I think, but you can go out and measure it yourself. I've got a little laser measuring device that I go out and just measure schemes with. Just conscious of time, there's a few more to go through, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I think that one is probably the key one that is on people's minds, but there are links with kind of lack of data. Of course, that how many people are you expecting to walk, cycle, what are traffic flows and speeds. It's often quite hard to have this data. Not many people have this data to hand. And then, of course, a lot of the tables and guidance in LTN120 is based on this. So it's quite key, really, as well as building business cases for using like the capital fund uplift tool and the active mode appraisal tool. You need to know flows. It can be difficult obtaining this data, and especially speeds and volumes for general traffic as well. So this is probably not new, but just to consider kind of doing traffic surveys or making use of surveys that have already been done. Rather unhelpfully, these often don't include pedestrians, so you might need to commission something separately, or if you get the opportunity, please ask them to include pedestrians in that. There's various sources of telematics data. They've got DFT, Traffic Master, and various private providers. We use some, I'm not going to name them because there's lots of different suppliers in the market that can provide that data. Obviously doing counts, you might have local screen line counts or automatic counters. We use Viva City for a few projects. You've got the tools like Apprenticed Cycle tool, not really designed to take flows out of, but people do use it that way. And there's in guidance, AT have provided kind of multiplying factors to factor up trips from the PCT. So if you've got nothing else, there are ways to do that are supported by ATA. Crowdsourced data like Strava, obviously there's considerations for who's using Strava, etc., but it can be valuable. And we have done some research at Arup to kind of compare actual counts with Strava data and have found quite a good correlation between that. So that is a resource that we do use. For the census data, it's obviously out of date now. Most people are still using 2011 data, and it's only journeys to work, and then doing kind of travel surveys. So I think you just got to make the best use of the data that's available, or go out and collect your own data, or kind of make your best estimate on flows, peak hour flows, they're often kind of lower than 300 or within certain ranges. So you should know or be able to work out within what range you're looking at. I will speed up. Difficulty making a strong economic case. Obviously quite
This is a
difficult.
good one though, Matt, because somebody's just raised a
Yeah.
question on this, so this is relevant.
Great. So yeah, if you're designing LTN 120 compliant schemes, they might cost more because they're better quality, and the higher costs give you a lower give you a lower BCR. If you're delivering a meaningful scheme, you then are probably likely to have greater impacts on general traffic. Which again, if you then start modeling it with a fixed matrix model and you monetize those impacts, you get massive disbenefits. Again, lowering your BCR. If you're then trying to make the case for shared use and saying, well, and basing that on the fact that you're expecting low flows, again, you end up with a low BCR because you end up saying there's not many people going to use it. So it does feel like it's kind of stacked against scheme promoters to make a good, strong economic case, which is one reason why in that interview with Chris Boardman, he's saying that AT are looking at active travel scheme appraisal and kind of ways to improve that because it's all based on ease of and reliability for other modes. And again, lack of data to support ambitious uplift aspirations. You get challenged by people in assurance if you then start to say we're going to be ambitious and aim for a big uplift figure. So yeah, it's really hard. But I guess obtaining the data that you need from the start, thinking about it from the start, developing schemes where there is demand, quite an obvious one. But if you're developing schemes where there isn't demand, it's always going to be hard to make a good case for it if you're going to spend money on it. We have looked at ways of kind of updating and manually updating model runs to whether it's through sensitivity testing or looking at kind of the do minimum scenario to kind of, I think a lot of models are predicting traffic growth, and I don't think that is actually the case in a lot of places. So I'm not going to say any more on that because I don't want to get in any hot water and it's outside of my area of expertise really, but just looking at the modeling and doing that earlier on, not leaving it until you're looking for approval for your business case, just trying to get your ASR nailed as soon as you can. Outside of AMA, and there's other impacts in tag that you can monetize. So we've done schemes where we've had bespoke accidents monetization to really try and boost that economic case. And again, yeah, there's other tools. A lot of the tools that get used are the active mode appraisal tool, the peak tool, which is a TFGM tool, which brings in other factors on top of AMA. There's the health economic appraisal tool, the heat tool, which just looks at increasing activity. There's lots of tools available, and I think just look at the ones that are most appropriate. And if there's any impacts, or I think there's other ones like the ABC tool, which tries to value public realm. But yeah, getting your kind of appraisal and economics people to look at all available tools to see if there's any other way you can boost your business case. Navigating design review panel.
Just to flag, Matt, that we're now into theoretically we did slightly predict that we had a lot of content. I mean, the other one, so just on this, is clearly the other cases and the strategic case and the importance of that really strong strategic case. But there is quite a lot of questions, so I don't know whether you just want to give the headings of the other challenges and then we can get on to the questions.
I'll wrap up. Yeah, navigating design review panels, hopefully not designing cycle lanes like that, but yeah, using tools, engaging A&E and your scheme promoters early, and then scheme opposition, obviously really important. There's lots of guidance to follow to do really good and meaningful engagement, seeking the views of people and getting a genuine exchange of views, and hopefully kind of mitigating that opposition and building schemes that are well, they're not always going to be supported by everyone, and getting the buy-in and building evidence to make the scheme deliverable. That's it.